Okay, great. As introduced, I'm Fundiswe Renene. I was born in 1974 in Beaufort West. I am the daughter of the late Kolegile Joseph Renene and Elsie Moabi. That was her maiden name. I'm the last born of 3 children. My eldest brother is Ulungile Renene. There are 4 years later. Then came Mulelo Renene, who is now, they're both in East London. And 4 years thereafter was myself, Fundiswe Renene. I now live in Beaufort West. Obviously, I have a very diverse, in terms of where I've lived, has been extremely diverse. I've lived between the Eastern Cape, Gauteng, England, and South Africa. But I currently reside in South Africa, in Beaufort West.
I believe that at a particular stage that your parents have resided in Beaufort West in the 60s.
Yes, they did live in the 60s. My father was born in 1942 in a place called Ekpamad, which is in Beaufort West in the Eastern Cape. However, his family moved up to Beaufort West, so he basically grew up in Beaufort West. If we start from the 60s, my father matriculated at Bastiaanse High School, which is still in the town, which is in a township that is predominantly what you would call coloured, per se, coloured township. So he matriculated there, then left for the University of the Western Cape, where he studied towards a Bachelor of Science, and a year later, because of the opportunities that were available to people at that point in time, he then had to do a diploma in teaching, which he completed in 1963. He then came back to Beaufort West and managed to get a job at Bastiaanse High School. However, his career or his working life at Bastiaanse was quite short-lived, if you want to say, because it was between 1964 and 1966, towards the end of 1966. Because at that point in time, I think the powers that be needed his academic know-how at that point in time. However, because of the laws of the time, he was not allowed to be a teacher at a coloured high school within Beaufort West. He then had an option. He was then given an option of either denouncing his Africanness or his blackness, whichever way you would like to look at it, which he refused to do at that point in time. So I think towards the end of 1966, beginning of 1967, he was forced to move out of Beaufort West. At that point in time, he was already married to my mother, and at that point in time, I believe my eldest brother was already born. So he had to basically get his whole family into a little car with as little possessions as possible and get out of this town as quickly as possible. He then went through back to the Transkei, which at that point in time was a homeland, to basically start off there. So that would be his history around the 60s. I know that he was part of the Pan-Africanist movement or the Pan-Africanist Congress, which I think it was relatively quiet. It was kind of like an open secret, and that is some of the reasons why Beaufort West as a place for him to be did not become feasible, because they had an eye out for him. So he then chose to go back to the...
So did the grandparents remain here in Beaufort West at the time?
My grandparents and the rest of his siblings did remain in Beaufort West. However, I do believe that his brother, his younger brother, or younger than him, had to, because of his political inclination, was forced to also move out of Beaufort West, which I believe he then moved, I think it would have been the late 70s. He was a businessman in Beaufort West, and with the uprisings at the time and everything that was going on, he then also had to leave Beaufort West for the then Ciskei, where he became, he was a businessman obviously, but then he went into hotels, etc. I think he by the time he passed on, he owned what was called the Horseshoe Motel in King Williamstown.
Okay.
But the rest of his siblings did stay, even though I think his youngest brother and one of his sisters then followed suit, but that was more educational, moving to the University of Fort Hare.
So, I believe then your father went to the Eastern Cape and then he continues with his education in the Transkei?
Yes, I think initially when he arrived on the Eastern Cape, he ventured into business for a few years. He then went back to the University of Fort Hare, where he studied towards a B.Juris, which I believe he was admitted into a B.Juris in 1972. And then in 1976 he then did his LLB. So he continued with his education right through in the Eastern Cape.
So did he have any time sort of a practice in company?
Okay. When he finished at Fort Hare, he became a lecturer there for a while, and then moved on to the University of the then University of Transkei in Umtata, and became a lecturer there. At that very same point in time, prior to him practicing, he then left the country to go and study a master's in law at the Harvard Law School. On his return, he then went into practice in Transkei. Yeah.
So at the time then you went abroad, you guys were left behind, or did you go as a family?
We partially went as a family, we partially were left behind. It happened in steps. He left, he was the first one to leave initially, and then my mum left after him. But obviously due to constraints in terms of school, etc., we stayed partially. But then it wasn't a very long stint in the US. And then I think he then came back in '84. After being given an opportunity to lecture at the University of Oklahoma, which he did for a while, when given the opportunity to stay in the US, because of his tremendous passion for South Africa, his tremendous passion for his people, per se, he felt that there was no way that he could stay in America, but he had to come back to South Africa.
So did he start practicing in Transkei?
Then he started practicing in Transkei.
Okay.
I think within the practice, after a while, there were a number of advocates that I can remember off of the top of my head that were part and parcel of the practice. For example, or advocate Madala at the time. And Judge Bam, who we used to call Prafix. That's the only way we knew him. There were quite a few people that were there at that point in time. Mr. Nzalumba. I think he was also exposed to people like Justice Madlanga. Justice Madlanga, at that point in time, I believe he did his articles through them, and I also believe that he lectured him for a while, either at Fort Hare or UNITRA, which I'm not too certain which one it was.
So, what was your mother doing at the time? Was she also teaching?
My mother, yes. My mother was, and always will be a teacher. My mum she also did her BA at the University of Fort Hare. And she basically taught at a school called St. John's College in Umtata for the longest time until she became the vice principal. But I believe by the time she left Umtata, she had gone up to being the principal of the school at the time.
So let's come then up to the early 90s. What was his job at the time?
My father was a practicing advocate in the early 90s. However, after the release of Utatu Madiba and being a member, a staunch member of the Pan-Africanist Congress, and being very active within the movement, when the time came for iCODESA, they were part of CODESA 1. They were part of CODESA 2. He was part of the technical committee that actually built up legislation at the time. So that in the early 90s was a very interesting time for him as well, but he was also at that point in time moving up within the legal structures because while they were still busy with Indoze CODESA, he was also then made silk, which was in 1993-94, I believe, and because everything happened so quickly at that point in time, he was then also while practicing and being advocate silk, he was then invited as a judge, and he was admitted. If I remember the certificates in the house, he was then admitted as a Supreme Court judge of South Africa. But due to his health, because that was around 1994, due to his health at that time, he didn't stay very long within that profile, because he was already ailing in health at the time.
So he worked up until 1996 or 97?
I would say he worked up until the day he died. My father passed away in October of 1997.
Okay.
After working as a judge, and at that point in time, he was placed a bishop.
Okay.
In
where the Supreme Court was.
Where the Supreme Court was at the time. And then, because of his ailing health, he then semi-retired to Kimberley, where he still practiced as an advocate, partially, and for the 2 years from 95 to 97 until his passing. So he was consistently active within that. I know that he was very active also within the structures. There's a legislature at the time, because I remember my brother went down to Kimberley. My eldest brother went down to Kimberley to join them. And at that point in time, I think the National Council of Provinces was being started up and etc. And I remember that through my father, he was then invited to be part of the initial group of people that were starting off the National Council of Provinces. That is, if I stand to be corrected if I'm getting my history right. So.
No, I'm raising this issue because this small town of Beaufort West, some people don't know that a person from Beaufort West has raised into the legal structures of South Africa and makes sort of a contribution in terms of the legal issues and how the National Council of Provinces, for example. Yeah. So, in general, how would you then describe your father, knowing very well that he comes from the Pan-Africanist background and so on?
I think I would describe him as overused as this term is nowadays, I think I would possibly describe him the way he described himself best, as the child of the soil. Yeah. I would describe him as a young boy who grew up in near poverty. I mean, my father was raised by a railway worker and a domestic worker, and through that, he managed to work himself out of the dusty streets of Beaufort West, and because of his passion, I think he had an immense passion for the people in the small town, and I believe that had he had the opportunity to stay here, and to develop within this particular town, I think possibly our history would be a bit different. Maybe, our history would be a bit different as well, because he was very passionate, he was very goal-oriented, he was very focused. First point, his major thing, getting us as black people out of poverty. Because I do believe that he had a hand, as much as he assisted his siblings that came after him with regards to their education and trying to get them a better future, which is very evident in their children as well. He also had a hand in assisting other people within the community. As a result, Beaufort West is very, those that can, or those that are willing to work hard enough, you find that even if you walk in the, which is a very strange phenomenon, even when you walk in the township in Beaufort West today, you meet people and you look at this guy walking and they say, no, that guy is a graduate. That guy is, those people, because of the environment that they came from, somehow managed to get themselves to a point where they could get into tertiary education, get that tertiary education. But then somewhere along the line, someone couldn't get, didn't have enough money to be able to actually get their certification, etc. They then come to Beaufort West, no family anywhere else, and then you end up being a part of these dusty roads. Exactly. But I think I see him in the people of Beaufort West. I think he was truly a son of the soil, and he was very, very, very passionate about the people of this town, and seeing them, advance and progress in their lives. I think that's how I would describe him.
Yeah. Given also the fact that in the 60s that he can be appointed as a deputy principal.
No, he was appointed as a teacher.
As a teacher in what you call a so-called colored community. It does reflect there was a certain level of recognition within the community.
Definitely there was. I still meet people to this day because I've lived in Beaufort West for 5 years because I moved from England and came and lived here. But you meet people within this community, and you still, when you hear the stories and they tell you the stories, and you realize that even not having grown up here, so this man was really from here, because there's so many, even when you go to Rustine, in the colored community, within the black community, when you talk to people, you see that he was a man that shared his life with the community. I shouldn't really say this, but I think at that point in time, he was also I think he saw ahead of his time.
Yeah.
He saw ahead of his time, because I think he was one of the people who saw a non-racial society at that point in time.
Exactly.
Because even though he was from the township, he lived in the township, there were exclusions, there were places he could go, but if you go into this town, the people that you talk to, it's from black to white to brown to whatever, and they tell you stories, they share history with him. So
this idea of non-racialism, he outlived it.
I think he definitely did outlive that whole concept of non-racial, because he lived it. He lived it, and I even remember one of my cousins, my aunt's sons, would always say he now has got a master's in something else. And he'd always say, when we grew up, he grew up right here, Mandlengos, and people would say, oh boy, his name is Beaufort Renene. He's such a troublemaker because he was also involved in the struggle at a very, very young age. But now I think the confusion for him was he believed his uncle to be, part of the struggle as well, which he was. But whenever he would then call him up and say, no, boy, you need to sort out your life. You need to go back to school. Because you've got to remember that liberation is coming. And when liberation comes, and you've been throwing stones all your life, what are you going to have? What are you then going to offer a democratic South Africa?
Yeah.
And he always says to me, and this is my cousin's story. He always says, I used to look at this guy and think he's absolutely crazy. He went back to school. He works now for the legislature. He's a firm believer in saying that if he had never ever had those conversations, because he was on the ground. He was running with the masses. But he's a firm believer that he wouldn't have moved up in his political, because he's got a master's in political science, he wouldn't have moved up in his political career and gotten to where he is had it not been, for his uncle.
When you're saying these things, there were people like us in the township. There are people like Tulompete, which I was with him in prison. There's Boy Ndwanyana, I was with him in prison. They are all from Beaufort West. And some guys who also, when we were out of prison, we went back to study at the university. So, and clearly in prison we were told by people like Norman Yengin and others that we needed a future South Africa with educated people, not people just we are throwing stones, but we need people who are going to be part of the redevelopment, reconstruction and development.
Yeah.
You understand? And really we went to school, you see. So I must say that your father, it's a caliber of the people who really inspired us to go back to school, because there were people who were like him, who will tell you, boys, go back to school. And really some of us got our degrees, and we are part of a government official and part of the reconstruction.